Water incidents. Among the many excesses of my youth, a rather notable place is held by a series of water incidents. The most amusing of them took place when I was at university. One summer after Eugeniusz, a female friend of mine, and I went down to the Vistula. We settled on a patch of greenery somewhere near Powiślo and fortified ourselves with alcohol. Not that we were seriously drunk, but we were definitely a little tipsy. This prompted Janusz and me to challenge the forces of nature. More precisely, the whirlpools which are said to abound in the Vistula, though that little detail escaped our attention. Our companion had no desire to follow our example, so she stayed on the bank, offering us moral support. And we, lacking swimsuits and any attachment to convention besides, evening was already drawing near. Stripped naked and just as God created us, trustfully threw ourselves into the depths of the Queen of Polish rivers, which so many times before had been the last chance of escape for resistance fighters, trapped by German forces, a fact we always held in grateful remembrance. And as brave sons of the nation, I too was glad to pass for a son, as later events confirmed. We swam out roughly to the middle, with the ambitious intention of reaching the far bank. What we had not foreseen, however, was that on the other side, almost directly opposite our starting point, stood the headquarters of the river police. Hence our deep astonishment when we suddenly realized that a police motorboat was speeding straight toward us, with 2 officers aboard. We broke into a swift crawl, trying to flee, but it was hopeless. They caught up with us in a few seconds, and under their escort we made for the shore. Or more precisely, they got there first. They moored, disembarked, and waited for us to swim in. We swam in, but we didn't climb out of the water just yet, uncertain what to do, for neither our clothes nor our companion were anywhere in sight. It later turned out that, seeing what was happening, she had wisely gathered up our clothes and went off into some bushes where she waited for the outcome. "All right, out you come, boys," the policeman demanded. And then they froze. For out of the water emerged Janusz, naked as Adam, which passed without much impression, and right behind him, a water nymph of exquisite beauty, blessed with a most generous bosom, which even when clothed, was accustomed to cause quite a stir among the opposite sex. My classmates would bet on the size, while Janusz liked to boast that I was always halfway there. What's more, that particular maiden had received the proper philosophical instruction from her mother. She already knew what was unworthy of shame, and so she emerged unpretentiously in all her glory, not feeling the least bit constrained. The policemen friends were quite shocked by this. They blushed charmingly and lost their composure. They ordered the water nymph back into the water, whereupon one of them stayed behind to guard her virtue, which, for the record, had long since been lost, while the other went off with Janusz in search of clothing. From then on, everything proceeded according to convention in a light version. We were lectured on the impropriety of our deed, handed fines, and parted ways with the authorities. But not for long. For a few days later, ring, ring, a phone call. It turned out that the commander of the river police had been missing me and asked that I present myself at the station. Fine, I go. They receive me almost with honors. We had arranged a specific day and time, and lead me into his office. I enter, say good morning, and modestly ask whether I may undress. The commander, with a sparkle in his eye, retorts, "Yes, of course," but this time all the way naked as well. Then he asks why I haven't yet paid the fine. In the innocence of those days, it never occurred to me, though it was more than obvious. that the commander could hardly be losing sleep over who had paid a fine, or when. All the less so when the payment deadline had not yet passed. Only later did it dawn on me that his subordinates must have filled his ears with tales of my guerrilla spirit, reinforced by my bosom. To his inquiries I replied truthfully that I had not paid for lack of cash, and did not know when I might expect any to come in. To this he responded with truly fatherly concern. He pulled out his wallet, handed me the required sum, and told me to go to the cashier. I brought him the receipt. He added it to his documents, and we spent another good hour chatting on general topics. Then he offered to drive me home, which met with my grateful approval, and thus the river police, with its nightly commander, inscribed themselves in golden letters in my memory. The first incident in my swimming career that might be called patriotic occurred when I was 16. I was staying with friends of my mother in Greifswald, a university town in East Germany on the Baltic Sea. One day my hosts took me to the sea. The day was cool. There were few people on the beach, and even fewer in the water. We walked along the shore for a while, after which they slipped away somewhere, and I stayed behind to swim. I swam leisurely, doing the breaststroke, but I had drifted quite far from the shore. Suddenly I realized that a group of Germans had joined me, probably students, but I never learned who they were, where they had come from, or when exactly they had chosen me as their target for play. At first I paid them little mind. They simply swam beside me. It was a little unnatural and awkward. I felt that something was brewing, yet nothing happened. Soon, however, they began to encircle me. They positioned themselves directly around me, 2 to my right, 2 to my left, and 1 behind me. It looked like some awkward courtship. I can't justify it otherwise. But I decided, all right, let them be. Besides, I had little to say, literally as well, for I knew no more than a few words of German. At one point I decided I had had enough and turned to swim back. Yet whenever I tried to do so, they stubbornly blocked my way, forcing me to continue in the same direction. They systematically cut off any possibility of other movement. I attempted to turn back several times, hoping they would relent, but I realized they would not. They were amused, and although they seemed to have no premeditated plan, they expected some spectacle from me, that I would cry, scream, beg for mercy. And since repeated attempts to break through their persistence were becoming humiliating, I thought, all right, I'll show them. I gauged the distance to the far shore. It was a lagoon, not the open sea. And though it only loomed faintly in the distance, I made a manly decision that I would sooner drown than give them the satisfaction. I would not let them toy with me. I began to push forward, calmly, methodically, consistently, like a little motorboat, no longer thinking of turning back. This threw them off. They hadn't expected such a turn of events. Practically the situation reversed. My determination disarmed them. They were now dependent on me. Their only hope might be that sooner or later I would give in. But I was fired by God, honor, and fatherland, and there was no sign of that. They swam beside me, compliant and stupefied, caught in their own snares. Several minutes passed. My previously unyielding companions began to show signs of unease. Until then they had swum silent as fish. Now suddenly they began to confer and shout over one another. I had no idea what they were saying, but the situation spoke for itself. They were literally beginning to falter. We had drifted dangerously far from the shore, and clearly they wanted to go back. But they were afraid to leave me. Yet since I had made my decision, I treated them like seaweed. I kept steadily paddling forward. Minutes passed. Their unease gave way to obvious agitation. Agitated, they muttered to one another in German, and finally began to argue. "Zurück! Zurück!" One of them seemed to faint, for he fell behind. 2 others turned back to assist him. They shouted again, pointing to the shore behind me. I swam on, deaf to their calls. Finally, desperate, they swam to block me from the front, and then one of them seized my hand and turned me 180 degrees toward the far shore. I decided that the course of events had sufficiently satisfied my sense of femininity and masculinity, and together we swam to the beach. My legs buckled beneath me when I finally felt solid ground under my feet. With unsteady steps, I began to walk away, without granting them a glance. Behind me I heard their excited comments. One of them called after me in farewell, "Schön, Mädchen." Of the water incidents, the naked ones, I remember one more as especially moving. Janusz and I were hitchhiking and got stuck on a side road with almost no traffic. For many hours we couldn't get out of there, until finally we settled resignedly in a nearby forest, where we spotted a little pond. We decided to wash and bathe, for after several days wandering the roads, our state of hygiene left much to be desired. Janusz stayed on the shore and began to wash, while I decided to swim first. At one point, quite unexpectedly, a group of local men appeared at the pond. They somehow spotted that a woman was swimming in the pond. It was really more of a large pool set in thick greenery, and after a brief whispered consultation, they eagerly jumped in. They swam around me, as if by chance finding themselves near me, seemingly casual, but clearly excited, waiting for some sign of panic or embarrassment. I waited a while, hoping they might give up and swim away, letting me leave the water in peace. But as the opposite seemed likely, I shrugged it off and decided to ignore their advances and their very presence. I climbed onto the shore. They hurried after me at once and sat a few meters away. Remaining by the pond, I asked Janusz, who had already finished his ablutions and was watching with amused understanding, to hand me the soap. Then, slowly, methodically, and with ease, I began to wash myself from head to toe, not neglecting even the more private parts, as if I were in my own bathroom. Something fell silent in the men. Their recent excitement gave way to a hushed, almost worshipful concentration as they watched, spellbound. One could sense they no longer felt themselves a group, that each was silently listening to some secret call within. I felt as if, in response to my unashamed nakedness, the band of frolicsome men had suddenly turned into several calm, self-aware young men. I noticed that they no longer looked openly in my direction, but only glanced at me out of the corner of their eyes, as if my behavior no longer seemed unnatural to them either. Only the most timid still stared at me with a wide-open gaze. I heard one of his older companions mutter to him, "What are you staring at? Haven't you seen a woman before?" And I felt as if he was sending me some secret signal that he was standing guard over my intimacy. It was a beautiful scene, full of deep, subtle meanings. I am certain it etched itself in my memory for life. At last I finished. I dressed, reached for my cigarettes and looked around for a lighter. The eldest of the men rose, came up to me and offered me a light. I will never forget with what dignity and admiring respect he lit my cigarette.